Hello, I'm Russell Haythorne with Denver 7, and welcome to Denver Decides. This community partnership is dedicated to accessible and transparent elections. The partnership includes the League of Women Voters of Denver, Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation, and is presented by Denver 8 TV. Today we are presenting a candidate forum in anticipation of the general election coming up on Tuesday, November 5th. Among other offices, this election includes the candidates vying to be the representative to the 119th U.S. Congress for District 1. District 1 is based primarily in the city and county of Denver. Our format for this forum will follow a basic debate outline with opening and closing statements, rebuttals, cross-examination, and will include responses to questions submitted by the forum organizers. All of the responses will be timed. Our timer monitors are out front for the candidates to easily view. So let's begin by meeting the candidates vying to represent Congressional District 1 in the U.S. House of Representatives. The candidates are standing left to right, facing the cameras in the order that their names will appear on the November ballot. So beginning at my right is Valdamar Archuleta, and here on my left is U.S. Congresswoman Diana DeGette, the incumbent in this office. Welcome to both of you. We will begin with 1-minute opening statements from each of our candidates, and we will proceed in ballot order with these statements. So once again, standing at my right, we will begin with an opening statement from Valdamar Archuleta. And Valdamar, thank you very much for being here.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so thank you all for being here. Thank you for hosting this, and thank you, Congresswoman, for being here as well. Look, we need change in Washington. And at this point, what have we got to lose to do that? And I say this because if you look at Congressional District 1, we've only had 2 different people represent this district in the past 51 years. That's not effective representation. And I say that because politicians know long term there's more money and more power in maintaining problems than solving problems. Denver's a wonderful city. It has great opportunities, and there's a great potential for it to advance. It's my home. And I've talked to the people in Denver. You have told me what your concerns are, what your issues are. And that's what I want to do. I want to find solutions to the problems you've presented to me. Now, I greatly respect my opponent, and I have nothing against her. But being a politician shouldn't be a career path. So I hope you'll give me some consideration today and look to a new approach for Denver.
Mr. Archuleta, thank you very much for that opening statement. And now, Representative DeGette, it is your turn. You have 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Hayworth and Channel 8 and all of the sponsors for hosting this debate. I think this is such an important exercise of our civic responsibility. As a fourth-generation Denverite and a South High School graduate, I am so privileged to represent the constituents of the 1st Congressional District. In the last term of Congress, even in the minority, I've been very effective as your representative. As the co-chair of the pro-choice caucus in Congress, I have fought for the restoration of reproductive rights under Roe versus Wade, and will continue to do that in the next Congress. As the vice chair of the Energy Subcommittee, I worked in a bipartisan way to actually pass legislation that became law to combat climate change. And I've been addressing homelessness by getting over $22 million for Denver in the last 2 years. I'm honored to represent you, looking forward to talking about the issues today, and it's going to be an exciting debate.
Congresswoman, thank you very much for that. That concludes opening statements. Now we're moving on to the rebuttal portion of this debate. And Congresswoman, it is your turn to go first. You have 1 minute to offer a rebuttal to Mr. Archuleta's opening statement.
As I mentioned in my opening statement just a second ago, I've been so proud to represent this district. And even though I've been in the minority, I think it's very important to work in a bipartisan way to solve the problems that impact this country. This has been the least effective Congress in the history of this country because of the Republican control. Even so, I worked with Congressman Jeff Duncan, who's my chairman on the Energy Committee, to actually pass legislation restructuring nuclear energy regulation in this country so that we can move closer to 0% carbon emissions by 2030. I'm very proud of that. I have several other bills that I believe will be passing in the lame duck session that'll be coming up, addressing maternal mortality, addressing prevention in healthcare, and so many other things. That's what you need to look for, not how long somebody's been in office, but rather what do they accomplish every day on behalf of their constituents.
Congresswoman DeGette, thank you for that rebuttal. And now, Mr. Archuleta, you have 1 minute to offer a rebuttal to the Congresswoman's opening statement.
Yes, I mean, I've really enjoyed this campaign. I've been able to go around the city of Denver here and talk to different communities and different peoples and neighborhoods. And I've heard the complaints that people have, what's affecting their life, the issues that they're facing. And primarily I hear it's the cost of living, especially with housing. Then you have crime, inflation, the immigrant crisis at hand, and education. And so these are the issues that really need to be looked at and need to be addressed. And I do think that there is something to being in Washington for a long time, because when I think about these issues, I think about the individuals I just spoke to. I don't belong to any I don't have lobbyists coming and talking to me. I don't have PACs coming and talking to me. I'm not in a bubble in Washington where after a while I think that becomes the focus on your mind. When you have issues come up, you think about the people in Washington, the people in politics, instead of the people of your district.
Valdamar, thank you for that rebuttal. Now we're moving into the cross-examination portion of this debate, and this is an opportunity for the candidates to ask questions of one another. We'll have 3 rounds here, and Mr. Archuleta, we'll begin with you. You have the opportunity to ask a question of Congresswoman DeGette.
Yes. So in 2021, when the federal government mandated the COVID-19 vaccines for federal employees, and there was widespread concern about potential long-term effects and the lack of dedicated compensation and support mechanisms, given that your district here in Denver includes the Denver Federal Building and a significant portion of the federal workforce, why did you not address these concerns at the time? And now, with more data on vaccine side effects, how do you plan to ensure that federal workers and all Americans will be protected in future public health mandates?
I'm so proud of the work that I have done and frankly, the Biden administration has done in addressing the COVID pandemic. And I think it is wrong for people to put false statements forward about the vaccine. This vaccine is safe, it's effective, and it saved millions of lives around the world. I do think that research continues to need to happen about long-term COVID that happens in some people. And also, we need to improve the vaccines as much as we can to make sure that everybody gets the vaccine, that everybody is protected against this. I know many of the people watching this debate tonight have friends or loved ones who were saved from death. And I'm proud of the work that I did with Dr. Fauci and with the administration to make those vaccines available through Operation Warp Speed and continue to make them safe and effective.
Congresswoman, thank you for that. Thanks for the question, Mr. Archuleta. And now, Congresswoman, it's your chance to ask Mr. Archuleta a question. He'll have 1 minute to respond.
Mr. Archuleta, I have a very simple question for you. Do you plan to vote for Donald Trump as the Republican nominee for this office?
Yes, I do. When I look at the 2 candidates side by side, we have Kamala Harris, who right now is presenting herself to the public as a very different candidate than she did 4 years ago when she ran for the office in 2020. So how do we know who she is and what kind of policies she's going to bring to the table when she has said both sides? Now, I did not vote for Donald Trump in the primary, even though he was going to be the likely winner. He was not my first choice to be our president, but he is the nominee. And I do look at the policies he brought to the table when he was president. And if we go back to 2019, the world and the country was a better place. We didn't have wars. Russia wasn't invading Ukraine. Israel wasn't being invaded by Hamas. The world was at a better peace. The economy was better. Unemployment was down. And so, I'll take a few mean tweets and unkind comments if we can get back to that, because I'm not voting for my moral leader. I'm voting for someone to take the lead in the country.
Mr. Archuleta, thanks for the response to that. Cross-examination round 2. And now, Mr. Archuleta, you have the opportunity to ask the Congresswoman a question.
Yeah, and this is more of a local issue, but I'd like your perspective on it. Denver has been ranking high, even topping a lot of the lists when it comes to crime and drug use. And recent actions by our mayor have reallocated and pulled funding from our already understaffed police department, essentially defunding the police. Do you believe these actions are at least in part responsible for the rise in crime in Denver?
Well, you're right, Mr. Archuleta. Crime, these issues that you're talking about are a local issue. And I don't know if any of our viewers have seen, we've got a lot to deal with on the national level right now. We do have some things to do with crime at the national level, and I've supported funding over the years for community policing and other block grants. I think it's important, though, again, not to distort what the record is. In Denver, over the last year, violent crime actually decreased during the first half of this year. Homicides went down by 8%, and violent gun crime is down by 14.5%. Property crime is down by 1/3 this year. Now, look, I still don't think that's good enough, but I think that the mayor, the district attorney, and the chief of police need to work on that. And I think if a candidate for office wants to focus on local crime issues, perhaps running for Congress would not be the best choice for that.
Representative DeGette, thank you for that response. And now, Representative, your chance to ask Mr. Archuleta another question, and he'll have 1 minute to respond.
Thank you so much. So, Mr. Archuleta, you admitted that you're going to vote for Donald Trump. So I would ask you, if you went to Congress in the 119th Congress, would you vote for Donald Trump's economic policies?
It would depend on what the policies are. We would have to look at each one at a time. Now, I'm not someone who's going to just toe party lines. I know my opponent here has never really pushed back on her party. I'm known for pushing back on my party. If you go back to June of this year, I rejected the endorsement from our state party because I didn't agree with an email they sent out and the way they were representing themselves. So I want to do what's best for the people of Denver, not what's best for Donald Trump, not what's best for a political party, but I want to do what's best for the people. So if a policy is presented in the economic world and it's going to be something that will be good for the people of Denver, then yes, I would support it. If it's not going to be good for the people of Denver, then no, I would be willing to vote no, even if it was going against Donald Trump.
All right, thank you both for those questions. One final chance to ask your opponent a question this evening, and this is the third and final round of cross-examination, and Mr. Archuleta, we'll start with you. You can ask one final question of the Congresswoman.
All right, so Palestine, Ohio still doesn't have clean water. Lahaina, Hawaii still hasn't had its debris cleaned out. We just had Hurricane Helene come and ravish the country. It's probably the most deadly hurricane we've had since Katrina. Now we're on the foot of, Hurricane Milton coming in tomorrow. All this, and you demanded in a letter, $3 billion from FEMA go towards migrants. Now Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas, in a warning, said that FEMA doesn't have enough money to last the hurricane season. All this while we've given $175 billion to Ukraine and $380 million to Lebanon. Do you feel that our federal government isn't doing a good enough job prioritizing the American people?
Well, Mr. Archuleta, again, the money that goes for disaster relief is very important, and I support that. The administration, it's different budget items, and the money that we need for disaster relief is there. I think Congress should go back into session and vote for the money for the disaster relief for the recent hurricanes. But Speaker Johnson has said he's not going to call us back in. I want to go back to your last answer, though, on Donald Trump's economic policy, because I felt like it was vague. Donald Trump has said all of our problems are going to be solved by tariffs. And so I researched that a little bit. The Economist noted that if his tariff policy was going to be implemented, it would add 1% to every single consumer good in this country. It would, quote, inflict significant collateral damage on the U.S. economy. It would cause decreased consumer spending, increased unemployment rates, and worse economic growth. Facts matter.
Ms. DeGette, you have one more opportunity to ask a question of Mr. Archuleta. and then Mr. Archuleta will have 1 minute to respond.
Mr. Archuleta, you just mentioned our aid to Ukraine, and so I want to ask you directly. Ukraine is our ally, and Russia has invaded Ukraine. Going forward, if you were elected, would you vote for additional aid to Ukraine?
That's a good question. Yes, what Russia did was wrong. They invaded Ukraine, and Ukraine was the victims here. However, if you look at the amount of money that's gone into going to aid Ukraine, how many people have died already in Ukraine, the lack of manpower that the Ukraine army has. Even the commander-in-chief of the Ukraine army has said that there's not going to be any beautiful end to this war. It's essentially at a stalemate right now. And so I would consider more funding to Ukraine, but there has to be conditions. One, we need to know where every penny is spent. Where's the money going? And there has to be a plan as to how we're going to end this war, because we don't want to have another multi-decade trillion-dollar war that's going to eventually end up being bigger. And for them to take back everything, they're going to need more people than just Ukraine, and I don't want U.S. troops over there. So there's going to have to be concessions, and we need a diplomatic end soon.
Thank you both for that healthy discussion. We're moving on now to the organizer questions. The organizers of this forum have submitted questions, and we have a number of them for both candidates, and both candidates will get a minute to answer each question. And Congresswoman, we will start with you. Do you support what was widely considered the bipartisan immigration bill that was defeated earlier this year? If yes, why? And if no, why not?
Thank you so much, Mr. Haythorne. And I support comprehensive immigration reform. We have 11 million people who are here whose status needs to be regularized. We also need to enforce our border. And as Vice President Harris said just last week, we need to increase the resources to deal with people who are coming and claiming asylum. We need to screen them. If it looks like they meet the threshold, then we need to give them work permits and get them into the court system so they can be adjudicated. I would have voted for the Senate bill. It's an incomplete bill, but it's a step in the right direction. And I was just as appalled as Senator Lankford, the Republican sponsor of that bill, and Mitch McConnell, and everybody else, that Donald Trump told them to kill that bill because he wanted to be able to use immigration as a campaign tactic. We shouldn't be using the lives of Americans and the lives of immigrants in that political way.
Congresswoman, thank you very much for that. Same question, Mr. Archuleta. Do you support what was widely considered the bipartisan immigration bill? It was defeated earlier this year. If yes, why? If no, why not?
No, I would not have supported that bill, and we also have to state that it had bipartisan opposition. The bill was not enough. It didn't accomplish what it needed to do. One, there was more money going to other countries, like $60 billion to Ukraine, $14 billion to Israel. Only 20 was actually going to our border. It was going to codify catch and release. It was going to weaken the asylum vetting that would happen at the border. It also had limits on it that of the amount of people who could come in, 5,000 people a day for a week or 8,500 for a day before it was instituted. There were also limits as to when it could be used, and it sunsetted in 3 years. So it really was not the bill that people make it out to be. I think the H.R. 2 bill of 2023 was a much better option, and I would have supported that.
Mr. Archuleta, thank you for that. Moving on to question number 2, submitted by the forum organizers. And Mr. Archuleta, you will go first this time. What tax policy do you want to see when the 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Act expire in 2026?
Yeah, our taxes are a problem. When you look at the tax code right now, it's 2,600 pages long. So it's very complicated. There's a bunch of loopholes in there. If I were to take my taxes to 5 different people and have them do my taxes, I would bet that each one of those 5 people would come up with a different number. And that's a problem. It needs to be simplified. I do like the flat tax proposal that Senator Ted Cruz proposed several years ago, because it lowered income tax and focused more on a consumption tax, but also incentivizes growth. So a lot of the numbers when looking at it initially looks like revenue would drop, but with that incentive for growth and the incentive for growth. In the long term, revenue would go up. So I would support redoing the tax code to something that was simple, and I would like to look at a flat tax.
Mr. Archuleta, thanks for that response. Congresswoman, same question. What tax policy do you want to see when the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire in 2026?
I'm actually going to answer your question directly. The Trump tax cuts, if they were extended by the next Congress, would cost $4 trillion over the next 10 years, or $400 billion a year. And that's something we simply cannot afford. Let's not forget, those tax cuts were targeted at the top 1% of taxpayers and at corporations. I think those tax cuts should expire, and I think if we're going to give tax cuts, we should give tax cuts to middle-income Americans, to people who are working every day and trying to pay for their rent and their food and their utilities. And by the way, this flat tax proposal that my opponent seems to like, it's a terrible idea, because what it does is it's a flat tax for Elon Musk and for Valdamar Archuleta and everybody else. And that is not a progressive tax system that has the wealthiest Americans paying their fair share.
Congresswoman, thank you for that. Let's continue with questions submitted by the forum organizers. This is question 3, and Congresswoman, you'll have the opportunity to take this one first. Do you favor Supreme Court reforms? And if yes, what do those reforms look like exactly?
Well, I think that I think it's outrageous that Supreme Court justices are allowed to fly around on private jets of Republican mega donors and activists. I think it's outrageous that they are allowed to have these very, very lucrative book deals, that they're allowed to have meals and fancy hotels and all of this with no accountability. We have an ethics code in Congress, and we have strict requirements that I completely agree with and that I report every time. And I think that that's one thing, is to have Supreme Court ethics reform. That would be important to shining the sun on the Supreme Court.
Congresswoman, thank you for that. Mr. Archuleta, same question. Do you favor Supreme Court reforms? And if yes, what does that look like?
I mean, I would agree that we don't want corruption in any part of our government, and there should be checks and balances there on these situations. One thing I have looked at and would consider as far as a reform to the Supreme Court is, one thing I'm big on all around is term limits. The president has term limits. I think Congress should have term limits. The Senate should have term limits. And I wouldn't be opposed to looking at maybe something that was proposed, maybe like an 18-20 year term limit on the Supreme Court. So that way there would be a rotation. And also, you wouldn't have presidents who maybe are going to put in someone who's really young, not quite as qualified, but because they want them to be there a long time, they're going to choose someone who's less qualified. I would consider something like that. I know a lot of people have been talking about packing the court. I would not be for that. I don't think that we should pack the court just to get agendas we want across the ballot, because in the long run, that's going to come back and bite you in the butt when the other side is in power.
Mr. Archuleta, thank you for that. Moving on to round 4 of questions submitted by the forum organizers. And Mr. Archuleta, you'll have the opportunity to go first. What would be the very first piece of legislation you would work on in the next session of Congress if you were to win this race?
I would like some legislation to be enacted that would require transparency in the bills we have. I mean, the fact that you can release a 1,000-page bill to Congress and then have them vote on it the next morning is ridiculous to me, because one, you know that nobody actually read that bill, and yet they're going to vote on it, and it's going to affect the lives of all Americans. And two, there's a bunch of stuff hidden in there. So I like what we do in Colorado, where we have single subject bills, and the titles of the bills have to actually represent what is in the bill. I also think there needs to be limits on how long people have to review it. Like, say there was a 1,000-page bill. You should not be able to vote on that the next day. You should have at least 3 days, plus I think maybe an extra day for every 100 pages the bill is. And this isn't just for the politicians to review the bill, but the people in the community, our organizations, our individuals, community leaders should be able to read these proposed bills and then talk to their representatives and let them know what they think about the bill being presented.
Mr. Archuleta, thanks for your response. Congresswoman, same question. What would be the very first piece of legislation you would work on in the next session of Congress if you are reelected?
Thank you. Well, first of all, Mr. Archuleta, I 100% agree with you. We have that rule right now. It's a 72-hour rule, but Speaker Johnson waived that rule, and I think we need to get back to regular order. My first matter of business in the next Congress, I'm likely, if the Democrats win the House, to be the chair of the Health Subcommittee. And I've worked on health care policy for many years. In 2016, I worked on a bipartisan bill to help biomedical research at the NIH and then device and drug approval at the FDA, 21st Century Cures. My first bill, I will be working with a Republican partner to expand healthcare research, to take advantage of all of the discoveries that we've seen in the past few years to help get cures much more quickly to patients, to cancer patients, to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, so many people. That's what all families care about, Democrats, Republicans, and independents.
Congresswoman, thank you for that. Mr. Archuleta, thank you for your responses. That brings us to the end of our debate, and now closing statements from each of the candidates. We will move to this portion, and each speaker will have 1 minute to offer a closing statement. And we'll go in reverse order of the opening statements, which means, Congresswoman, you will go first. You have 1 minute.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you for hosting this debate. Mr. Archuleta, thank you to you for running. That is really an exercise of your civic duty, and I think it's so important. This next election is going to be so important for, and I've talked about many of the things I've done, but there's so much more that needs to be done. We need to make sure we move forward by making Roe versus Wade the law of the land so everybody can get the health care they need. We need to make sure that we continue to address the climate change. And we need to make sure that the constituents of the 1st Congressional District, people who I help get Social Security checks for and veterans benefits every day, continue to get that high quality of service. This is a difficult job, but it is so rewarding when you can go in every day thinking, how am I going to work today to improve the lives of my constituents and the lives of all Americans? I ask for your support in November, and I look forward to representing you for the next 2 years. Thank you.
Congresswoman, we appreciate the closing statement. Mr. Archuleta, it is your turn. You have 1 minute.
Yes, and I'll say it again. I was born and raised in Denver. This is my home. My family, friends are here. I work 2 jobs to maintain my life here. I know what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to go to the grocery store, hand them your debit card, and be terrified that it's going to be declined. I also know what it's like to have it declined and have to walk out empty-handed. Now, I'm not saying this because I want sympathy. I'm happy with my life and where I am and what I do. I have a great house, 2 dogs, a cat, a yard, and I'm surrounded by wonderful people. But this isn't about me. I have spent the past 10 months talking to people and communities and neighbors about what's affecting them and the problems they're seeing in their life with inflation, the cost of living, and crime really going up in this city despite what some numbers may say about it. And with that is why I put my priorities here is to lower the cost of living and make our neighborhoods safer. Now, I know I'm a Republican. Typically, you don't vote for Republicans, but I've shown that I'm willing to stand on principles and go against my party when I need to. My opponent has not pushed back on her party ever, and as you heard tonight, most of her talking points were about going against Republicans. I don't want to be partisan. I want to represent you, the people of Denver, and so send me to Washington.
Mr. Archuleta, thank you for that closing statement. Again, Congresswoman, thank you for yours. On behalf of the forum organizers, I'd like to thank you both for participating in this debate. And audience, now it's your turn to show your appreciation to the 2 candidates. You can applaud. On behalf of the forum organizers, I'd like to thank you again. We hope we have given you a fair look at the candidates vying for representative to the 119th United States Congress for District 1. Our thanks also to the Denver Decides partners, which include Enter Neighborhood Cooperation and the League of Women Voters of Denver. Denver Decides is presented by Denver 8 TV. Remember, the general election takes place on Tuesday, November 5th, so be sure you're registered and get out there and vote. For complete election information online, go to denverdecides.org or denver7.com/Denver Decides. Stay with us for more Denver Decides forums coming up. For now, I'm Russell Haythorne with Denver 7. Thank you for joining us.